When my 6-year-old daughter handed a handmade Christmas Eve gift to my parents, they looked her dead in the eye and said, "Don't call us grandma or grandpa, your family is too poor for us to be related." Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Maren Hale, and I spent years believing my parents were strict but decent. When I became a single mom, they changed. They made small comments about my job and my apartment, pretending they were helping, but their words always stung. My daughter, Reby, never noticed any of that. She just loved them. She worked hard on a little pinecone ornament, tying red ribbon and writing their names in her shaky handwriting. On Christmas Eve, she walked up to them with the biggest smile. Judith pulled back like Reby was handing her garbage. Roland wouldn't even look at it. When they told her not to call them grandma or grandpa, something in Reby broke. She ran to the car crying, and I felt every tear like a punch. I finally stood up to my parents. They insisted they were being honest, but I was done. I cut contact and focused on building a better life for my daughter. It wasn't easy, but slowly we climbed out of the struggle. I worked extra hours, saved money, and eventually moved us into a small but peaceful home. 2 years later, my parents tried to come back when they heard I was doing well. Reby hid behind me. I told them they lost their titles that night. Now, every Christmas, we hang her little pinecone ornament on our own tree, and she tells me, "Mom, I'm happy it's just us." And honestly, I am too. My name is Maren Hale, and for most of my childhood I convinced myself my parents, Judith and Roland, were simply demanding. I tried to believe every harsh comment or cold glance came from some twisted version of care. But growing older showed me something I never wanted to admit: their affection only existed when I fit the picture they wanted. As long as I followed their plans, stayed quiet, and made them look successful, they acted like parents. The moment I stepped outside that image, everything changed. When I walked away from my ex and chose to raise my daughter on my own, they treated my decision like a stain on their reputation. They didn't ask if I was safe or how I was coping. They didn't ask about Reby's well-being. They only cared that I no longer matched the perfect story they liked to tell about our family. Every conversation became a reminder that I had disappointed them. They spoke to me like I was a burden they were forced to handle rather than someone they raised. Even simple things turned tense. If I mentioned needing help, they called it proof I wasn't capable. If I stayed silent, they accused me of hiding failures. I kept trying to earn some sign of warmth, but nothing I did mattered. The more I focused on giving my daughter a peaceful life, the more they acted like I had betrayed them. I realized that in their eyes, being a single mom wasn't just a mistake, it was an unforgivable offense. It took time for me to understand that their disappointment had nothing to do with love. It was about control, appearances, and pride. And that truth changed everything for me moving forward. Life with my daughter, Reby, has always been the calm in the middle of every storm. She has this soft way of moving through the world, like everything deserves a little extra gentleness. After school, she usually settles at the kitchen table with her box of scraps, paper edges, fabric pieces, stray buttons she collects like treasures. She never asks for expensive toys, she prefers things she can turn into small surprises for the people around her. Most afternoons, I hear the tap of glue bottles and her tiny hums as she works. She's patient in a way that children her age rarely are, taking her time to arrange colors and shapes until they feel just right to her. She tells me she likes creating things because it makes hearts warm, and honestly, she's right. Her projects have filled our home with little tokens taped to walls, tucked onto shelves, and pinned to the fridge. When December came, she decided she wanted to make something special for the holiday gathering. Nobody pushed her. She just woke up one morning with a spark in her eyes and said, "Mom, I know what I want to give them." She gathered pine cones she'd collected from the park, carefully choosing the ones without broken tips. Then she picked out red ribbon from her craft box and a tiny scrap of gold thread she'd been saving. For 3 days, she sat at the table after dinner, shaping her idea bit by bit. She glued the pine cones together, wrapped them with ribbon, and tied the thread into a little loop so it could hang. Every night she held it up to me, asking if I thought they would like it. She wanted it to look special, not fancy, just filled with the love she put into it. By the time she finished, she was glowing with pride, clutching the ornament like it carried a piece of her heart. The weeks leading up to the holiday were already heavy. Every time I spoke to Judith and Roland, there was some little jab tucked into their sentences. They acted like my work at the dental lab was beneath them, reminding me how different my life would be if I had followed the path they planned. They questioned everything, from the hours I worked to the choices I made for Livy. Nothing was ever neutral with them, it always carried a sting. They had a way of saying things that sounded polite on the surface, but underneath was the message they really meant. If I mentioned being tired, they hinted I wouldn't be exhausted if I had ambition. If I talked about Livy's crafts or her school projects, they suggested I was encouraging small dreams. They weren't even subtle anymore. It was as if they wanted to chip away at every accomplishment I managed to build. What bothered me most wasn't what they said about me, it was the comments they aimed at my daughter. They never spoke to her with direct cruelty, but the tone they used when discussing how I was raising her carried enough judgment to make my stomach twist. They implied she needed more discipline or better direction, even though all she ever showed them was kindness. Still, I kept trying to smooth things over. I thought if I stayed calm, maybe they would soften. I hoped the holiday would remind them that the season wasn't about status or money, but about being present for the people who should matter. I convinced myself that if we just got through the tension, maybe the evening could be peaceful. I clung to that idea, even though a quiet voice inside me knew their attitude rarely changed. I just wanted one night where they put aside their criticism and remembered they were part of our lives. When we stepped into my parents' living room on Christmas Eve, Livy held the small ornament in both hands, wrapped in a bit of tissue she'd folded herself. She walked toward them slowly, almost tiptoeing, her voice soft as she said she'd made something for them. For a moment, I hoped maybe the holiday mood would soften their usual sharpness. But the second Judith saw the bundle, her expression hardened. She pulled her hand back like Livy was offering something dirty. There wasn't even a polite attempt to hide her reaction. Roland glanced at the ornament, barely giving it a second look, and shook his head with a dismissive sigh. The room felt colder in an instant. Judith didn't reach for the gift. She didn't lean down or ask what it was. She simply turned her face away, as if acknowledging Livy at all would somehow inconvenience her. Roland muttered under his breath, loud enough for both of us to hear, that people of their standing shouldn't be expected to accept handmade items. His tone carried this strange mix of embarrassment and disgust, like Livy's gesture was something shameful. Livy froze, her hand still outstretched. Her eyes moved between them, searching for any hint of warmth. Instead, Judith's voice cut through the room, sharp, cold, final. She told Livy not to use the family titles anymore. She said those words belonged only to households that, in her mind, hadn't fallen. Her phrasing wasn't shouted, but the cruelty in it hit louder than anything she could have yelled. I saw Livy's shoulders fold inward as the meaning sank in. She clutched the ornament back to her chest and stepped away, confusion and hurt mixing in her eyes. The room fell silent except for her tiny breath catching, and in that moment, something in me shifted completely. Livy stood there for a moment, still holding the little ornament close to her chest. Her eyes were wide, stunned, as if she couldn't quite understand what had just happened. Then her lips started to shake, the way it always did right before she cried. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it came out as a fragile whisper, asking why they didn't want what she made. There was no anger in her tone, just confusion and a hope that maybe she had misunderstood. Judith didn't even look at her. She shifted her attention toward the tree as if Livy hadn't spoken at all. That silence hit harder than any harsh word. Roland gave a small flick of his hand, the same gesture he used when a server lingered too long at his table. It was meant to shoo her away, like she was an inconvenience instead of a child trying to offer something from her heart. I watched Livy's face crumple in an instant. She pressed the ornament against her chest, holding it so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a second she looked back at me, eyes full of a question she couldn't put into words, Why the two people she thought she was supposed to trust wouldn't accept something she made with so much love. Then the tears came. She turned and ran, her small footsteps echoing through the hallway as she pushed through the front door. I followed her outside, and by the time I reached the driveway, she was already at the car, struggling to pull the door open through her sobs. She climbed into the back seat, curling into herself, still clutching the ornament like it was the only thing keeping her together. I closed the door gently behind her, my heart breaking as her cries filled the quiet night. When I saw Libby collapse into tears, something in me rose so fast I barely recognized myself. I had spent years swallowing comments, nodding through criticism, pretending their coldness didn't cut as deeply as it did. But watching my daughter run out into the night because of their cruelty shattered whatever restraint I had left. I stepped back into the house, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I told them they had crossed a line that could never be undone. My hands were trembling, not from fear but from everything I had buried for so long, every dismissal, every judgment, every moment they made me feel small. I finally said what I should have said a lifetime ago. They didn't flinch. Roland looked at me like I was being dramatic, insisting I needed to face the truth about where we stood in life. Judith added that I was clinging to choices that dragged everyone around me downward. The words were sharp, but what struck me most was how calm they were saying them, as if what they had done to Livy was nothing more than correcting a child who stepped out of line. My voice cracked when I told them I wouldn't allow my daughter to carry the weight I had carried growing up. They brushed it off, calling it an overreaction, insisting they weren't obligated to indulge us. That was the moment the last thread between us snapped. I turned away from them without another word. As I closed the door behind me, it felt like leaving more than just a house, it felt like stepping out of years of being made to feel unworthy. I walked back to the car where Livy was curled up, and while she cried in my arms, I promised myself quietly and fiercely that they would never again have a chance to wound her. Cutting ties happened quietly. One day I simply stopped reaching out, and from that moment on, the distance grew by itself. With no one else to lean on, my world narrowed down to just me and Livy. Every decision, every long night, every early morning revolved around keeping our little life steady. Without anyone stepping in to help, I had to stretch myself in ways I never had before. I picked up extra shifts whenever they were offered, even if it meant coming home after dark and heating up dinner half asleep. The dental lab became my second home. The hum of machines, the steady rhythm of the work, it all pulled me forward. I learned new tasks, trained under people who didn't look down on me, and slowly earned their trust. They noticed when I arrived early and stayed late, and eventually more responsibility came my way. Each small step felt like proof that I could build something solid without leaning on people who only brought harm. Money was still tight, but I started saving little by little. A few dollars here, a few more there. I kept track of every bill, every expense, determined to create a cushion for the two of us. When I moved us to a slightly better place, I handled the boxes myself and kept the details to myself. I didn't send a new address. I didn't explain the changes in my job or home. I didn't give updates, invitations, or apologies. Life became quieter without their voices in the background. The silence felt strange at first, then comforting. I realized how much energy I had spent trying to meet expectations that were never meant for my happiness. Now everything I did was for Livy and the small future we were shaping together, one long shift at a time. 2 years moved by in a steady rhythm, each day shaped by effort and quiet determination. Little by little, our lives began to change. The cramped basement place where we once lived felt smaller every month, and eventually I gathered enough savings to look for something healthier for us. When I found a modest townhouse with sunlight in every room and a small patch of grass out front, it felt like stepping into air we hadn't breathed in a long time. Carrying our belongings up those steps felt like crossing a finish line only I knew existed. At the lab, the long hours and constant learning paid off. I took on tasks others avoided, stayed patient when things got complicated, and paid attention to every detail. My supervisor noticed, and one morning she called me into her office to tell me she wanted me to lead the team. Hearing those words felt unreal. I accepted the position, proud not because I needed anyone's approval, but because I had built something through my own hands. With the raise, I finally created the emergency fund I'd dreamed of, something I could rely on when life got unpredictable. I even set aside time on weekends to craft custom dental appliances for clients who needed specialty work. It started as a small idea, something to bring in a little extra, but it grew into a steady side job that gave us security I never thought we'd have. Livy changed too. School became a place where she blossomed. She made friends who matched her gentle spirit, and therapy helped her untangle the hurt she carried from that Christmas Eve. Her teachers told me she was opening up more, that her creativity was shining again. Watching her rediscover joy reminded me that every long shift, every sacrifice, had been worth it. Rumors moved faster than I expected. One chilly afternoon, there was a soft knock at the townhouse door. When I opened it, there they were, Judith and Roland, standing with stiff posture and smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Judith's voice trembled as she said they had missed Livy terribly and wanted to see her. Roland nodded beside her, offering a forced, polite greeting that felt hollow. Livy immediately stepped back behind me, clutching my hand. Her small body stiffened, and I could see the memory of that Christmas Eve still lingering in her eyes. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just pressed closer to me as if to remind them she remembered everything. Judith sniffled as if trying to produce tears, but the act was too obvious, and even I felt the weight of the performance more than the sentiment. They lingered awkwardly in the entryway, shifting their weight, hoping for a response. I didn't invite them in. I didn't ask them to explain or apologize. Instead, I watched Livy carefully, gauging her comfort. My parents' attempts at charm were clumsy, their words empty. They talked about the neighborhood, the weather, even Livy's school, but all without acknowledging the pain they had caused. Finally, I spoke quietly but firmly. I reminded them that the choices they made years ago had consequences. Livy didn't owe them anything. Her small hand squeezed mine as she peeked out, uncertain but trusting me to handle it. That day, I realized that success and distance had shifted the balance completely. What they had lost could never be replaced by fake smiles or empty claims of longing. I faced them squarely, my voice steady though my chest felt heavy. I reminded them of the night they had broken my daughter's heart, the night they made a 6-year-old feel worthless for giving something from her own hands. I told them clearly that the names they wanted, grandparent, guardian, mentor, were no longer theirs to claim. Those words had meaning, and they had destroyed it themselves. Roland opened his mouth, trying to insist that time could heal, that respect and recognition could be earned back. He spoke in measured tones, as if offering logic could erase the memory of their cruelty. But I didn't falter. I couldn't. Years of hurt and every tear Livy had shed fueled my resolve. Their empty promises had no place here. Judith's face twisted, as if she couldn't understand why we wouldn't forgive and move on. I stayed calm, letting my words land, letting the weight of our lives without them sink in. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I simply told the truth, and that truth was enough. Behind me, Livy's small voice trembled but was firm. "Mom, I don't want them." Her eyes met mine, filled with the mix of fear and courage only a child can have when trusting the parent beside them completely. I nodded to her, letting her know that her voice mattered, that her feelings were enough. In that moment, I knew nothing would change. The confrontation wasn't just about words, it was about reclaiming our lives, setting boundaries that would never again be crossed. And when Livy squeezed my hand, I understood that some doors, once closed, were meant to stay shut forever. For years, my parents had built their image carefully, always presenting themselves as generous and respectable. It was part of the town's perception of them, a carefully maintained facade. But when people started asking why Livy never showed up for visits or holiday gatherings, I realized I didn't have to protect that image anymore. I could simply speak plainly. I explained what had happened that Christmas Eve, keeping my words even and measured. I didn't exaggerate, I didn't shout, I just told the truth. They had treated a child like she didn't matter, dismissing her efforts and calling her family unworthy. I let the story stand on its own, letting neighbors draw their own conclusions. The effect was quiet but immediate. Invitations stopped coming their way, friendly waves became rare, and people who once looked up to them began keeping their distance. They tried to maintain appearances, smiling and waving at community events, but the warmth they expected no longer returned. Their carefully polished reputation cracked, and it was painfully obvious to anyone paying attention. It wasn't a dramatic showdown, and no one needed to cast judgment, they saw it themselves. Their pride, the very thing they had clung to, became the instrument of their punishment. The town watched as the Hales, long thought untouchable, lost their aura of generosity and sophistication. Meanwhile, Livy and I lived quietly, without needing to explain ourselves. Our lives continued, filled with small victories, laughter, and safety. The justice wasn't a confrontation, it was the slow, undeniable awareness by everyone around them that those who humiliated a child were not the people they pretended to be. Watching that truth settle quietly around them felt like the reckoning they had earned. After weeks of awkward attempts and half-hearted apologies, they finally came directly, pleading for another chance. They tried to explain themselves, offering excuses and promises, but their words rang hollow. I listened, but there was nothing left to salvage. I realized some wounds couldn't be patched by claims of regret or temporary sentiment. Without hesitation, I made my decision. I blocked their numbers, cutting off their ability to reach us whenever they wanted. I returned the holiday cards they had sent, neatly sealing them back in the envelopes, a small but firm statement that empty gestures meant nothing. I didn't argue, I didn't explain, I simply acted. Livy watched quietly, her small face serious, and I saw in her eyes the trust she had placed in me. That trust became my guide. I spoke gently to her, telling her that some people aren't meant to be part of our lives, no matter what they say. I promised that from now on, no one could ever make her feel small or unwanted again. Every attempt they made to insert themselves back into our world was met with silence or refusal. They tried visiting the neighborhood, calling friends in common, sending flowers, even writing letters. Each time, I ensured it reached no one, leaving them isolated from the life they had once tried to dominate. The decision wasn't easy emotionally, but it was necessary. I wanted Livy to grow without fear, without disappointment shadowing her every step. That night, after the last card was returned and the door firmly closed, I felt a weight lift. Our home was ours, completely ours, and Livy's heart would remain safe from those who had once sought to wound it. Last Christmas Eve, I watched Livy carefully untangle the ribbon on her old pinecone ornament, the same one she had made years ago. She held it up to the tree, her small hand steady as she found the perfect branch to hang it on. Her eyes sparkled in the soft glow of the lights, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't realized I'd been missing for so long. She stepped back, studying her work, and then turned toward me with a shy smile. "Mom," she whispered, tilting her head. "I'm glad I have you." The simplicity of her words struck me harder than anything my parents had ever said or done. It wasn't about gifts, status, or appearances, it was about love, presence, and safety. I knelt beside her, taking her small hands in mine, and hugged her tightly. In that embrace, I understood that all the pain, the struggle, the long nights and hard work had led to this exact moment. We were safe, we were thriving, and we belonged to each other completely. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of peace that had nothing to do with my past or the people who had tried to define it for me. The ornament swayed gently in the light, a reminder of innocence, resilience, and the power of protecting the ones you love. I realized then that the true gift wasn't material. It wasn't approval or recognition from anyone else. It was the freedom to let go of those who never deserved our trust and to fully embrace the family we had built ourselves. Holding Livy close, I smiled through my own tears, knowing we were finally home, together, whole, and safe.